hour. I want to welcome you all. It's good to see all of the students. Thanks for coming out in the rain, or what's going to be rain. We have a very important program for you today. This lecture is always the one that we feel imparts a great deal of the spirit of what we do when we can hear from people who have experienced that which we hope to prevent in the future. At this point, I would like to introduce Christine Davidian, who is the president of the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide at Sonoma State. They are the group that provides us with the money that we use for honoraria and travel costs and lecture fees. Christine has a few words about the person to whom this lecture is dedicated. Sure. Do you need the microphone?
Can everybody hear me okay? Everybody? Okay. First thing I want to talk about is through the Jewish Community Federation, we get a special grant. And so in order to keep track of our program, we ask that those people who are guests to our lecture, please sign in so we can keep track of the number of people who do attend our program. So I'm going to send this back, I think, up this way here. If we don't mind sending this back, we can get you guys later. I know there's some guests back here, so if you don't mind sending this back, if you don't mind sending this back up to the guests that are in the back row, that'd be wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you for signing.
No problem.
No podium. Okay. Well, I hope people can hear me okay. I'd like to, well, this lecture is dedicated to Adele Ziegelbaum, who is a Holocaust survivor. And so what I'd like to do today is talk about what, her memory and, what she survived. And we are happy to have her son in the audience, Paul, today. So thank you for coming today. I have a very detailed description of biography, but Paul, if you don't mind, I'm going to go through as quickly as I can, but we'll try to honor her the best we can today. Adele Ziegelbaum was born in, please, the word Slavkowen? Slavkowen? Is that correct? Slavkowen? Oh, really? Okay. In 1924, in a small town near the city of Krakow, Poland, to Israel and Rachel Webzers, Websky. Thank you very much. She was not quite 15 years old in 1939 when the Germans invaded Poland. All the schools were shut down after German occupation, and Adele was forced by the Germans to do menial labor in their offices and quarters. Her brother Motek left home in 1940 to work as an engineer and was not heard from again. In 1941, all the Jews in Slachau were moved into a ghetto. Later that year, Adele's older sister was taken to a concentration camp in Czechoslovakia. On June 11th, 1942, the Germans forced all the residents from their homes into the middle of the town without their belongings, where the Germans separated families and committed many murders and other atrocities. Adele braved the German threats and ran home to retrieve family photographs, which she hid in her shoes. She managed to keep these pictures throughout the war and still has them. Upon returning to town, Upon returning to town, she was separated from her parents and a younger sister Rose and older sister Esther. She never saw her parents or younger sister again and does not know their fate. It's possible that her sister Rose was taken to Theron's. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Apologize. I'm going to go on to. Adele was in multiple concentration camps from that point on. But in 1944, once liberated, the Russians took her to a hospital and she was treated for malnutrition. She then volunteered, after going through that treatment, she was treated and wounded. She was in training, she volunteered for training and treatment of wounds of Russian soldiers. After 6 weeks in the hospital, she returned to Slachau, but soon left for Sosnowiec, a nearby town which she attended school. There she was reunited with her older sister Esther, who had survived the camps. And in September 45, the two of them moved to Warsaw, Poland. Shortly thereafter, she met Joseph Ziegelbaum, a well-known hero of the Polish underground, whom she married that December. They moved to a displaced persons camp, made it to New York. She had her first son, Arthur, and then the family moved to Los Angeles, and then they had Paul, and they became citizens in 1952. What I wanted to say, which is very, very interesting about this next part, is that while she was in camps, Adele never saw a butterfly, a flower, or a bird. She used to wish that she could become a butterfly so that she could fly gently out to the electrified wire fence without burning her wings. Today, she was seldom without a scarf, a vest, or a piece of jewelry bearing the image of a butterfly. What's amazing about that is the center logo is a butterfly fluttering through the wire fence. So that imagery is just so symbolic for us. Adele's advice is never to forget what happened, to tell the story so that it would never happen again, to remember the people that we've lost, to honor those who were not even privileged to have their own graves, and to understand that we are not responsible for our births. But we are for our own conduct.
It's indeed a pleasure to be able to present this panel. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our speakers for today. Our first speaker, not necessarily in this order, is Vera Korkus. Our next speaker is Lillian Matamore. And our next speaker is Maurice Blond.
How do you do?
Now you may or may not want to use this.
I'm going to move it down.
Over here. This picture was taken on Adele's wedding day. It's quite a striking pose. Almost contemporary, right?
It's beautiful.
I don't want
I'm
that.
reading the back of this.
You're reading the back. Okay.
There we go.
I'm going to be the moderator. And you can see we have two people here who already have their own watches, which is nice. They're going to speak for about 20 minutes each. They're going to speak for about 20 minutes each. Why don't I introduce Maurice first? I don't want to give you too much of his story because I know he probably wants to share it with you. He lives in Healdsburg, and he lived in Holland before the war. Because his father was suspicious of events in Germany, Maurice and his family left for France in 1939. But unfortunately, as he put it, we did not go far enough. Trapped in occupied France without proper papers, they managed to flee to North Africa and from there to Lisbon in Portugal, where they caught the last U.S. ship that had set sail in Athens. His brothers now reside in England and Holland, and spent 1939 to 1942 in England before joining the family in the United States. The rest of his family was murdered, including his grandmother, who was in her 80s. Before retiring, he was professor in the Hutchins School of Liberal Studies at SSU. So he has a motto, and that is, do not assume that it can't happen here. Assume it can, and work to stop a drift that makes the next Holocaust or genocide possible. So I present Maurice.
Thank you for having me. I suppose, like many other American Jews, I come from a family that started in Eastern Europe in what is called the Pole of Settlement, what is now Ukraine, Belarus, in that area. My parents, at various times in the 19th and 20th century, moved west to Holland under the pressure of discrimination and violence. And Holland was good to my parents. By the time the 1930s arrived, they had a thriving business, they had 2 children, they lived well. In 1936, a friend of my father, who he had known earlier in his life when he had fought in the First World War in the Austro-Hungarian army, came through Holland on his way out of Europe. And what he told my father about what was going on in Germany next door shook my father. The Dutch Jews had always thought, well, we keep hearing these things about Hitler, but we're almost Germans and everything is going to be okay. They're not going to bother us. They did not realize the brutality of the regime next door. Well, what my father did was to make some plans. He put some money in America, where he had been in 1905. He'd left his brothers here, and he returned with his father to Europe. He put my 2 older brothers in school in England with relatives, and took myself, we went down to Monte Carlo in the south of France to see what was going on. Well, what was going on didn't appear to be much. Poland, was occupied. And then on May 9th, 1940, a postcard arrived from Amsterdam, and it was written by friends of my father. Incidentally, this couple would spend 4 years hiding under the floorboards of someone who was willing to risk their life to keep them alive. But in May 9th, 1940, they wrote, the Concertgebouw, which is the National Orchestra in Amsterdam, opened its season last night. It was a wonderful concert, everything is well. On May 10th, 1940, my father went out to get bread, which we usually do in France early in the morning, and came back ashen with the news that Holland had been invaded, as was Belgium, as was France. And they began to, they had heard, let me back up. One of the things that my father did was to try to get rid of his Dutch guilders, and he went to the consul, and I better watch the time, and to exchange it, which the consulate did. And my father had to sign a receipt, which he signed with a gold pen. And the consulate said, "Oh, what a wonderful pen. Thank you." What do you say to that? You say nothing, because you're glad to have get rid of the currency, which is now worthless. In the course of trying to get out of France, or being in France, you had to give over your passport to the French authorities. And one of my memories is going up a long flight of stairs, at the head of which was a soldier standing with a rifle and a bayonet, dressed exactly, as I found out later on, in the uniform that the French soldiers wore in World War I. Well, mysteriously, our passports disappeared. So where did they disappear to? Well, they probably disappeared into the pocket of a German Jewish immigrant, or perhaps a German communist trying to hide from what they knew was coming. Anyway, we were now paperless. And at that point, my father had heard that the British had sent a fleet to pick up British subjects in the north, in Biarritz, which is just where France turns a corner and becomes Spain. And they went there, and the British did in fact show up. They would have taken my mother, because she is born in London. They would have taken me as the child of a British citizen, but they would not take my father because he had fought in the Austro-Hungarian army and he was an enemy alien. So my mother decided no, she would stay. There was a slight problem with this, is my parents, as good middle-class people, had 18 pieces of luggage and no car. So now the question is, how are you going to travel around France with all of this garbage, or baggage, I should say. Here's where luck came in. As we were walking through the streets, my father bumped into a man, and being polite, he turned to him and said, "Excuse me." And who he said excuse me to was a man who he had known slightly in Amsterdam. He had a car, he had a wife, and he had a child. There must have been some negotiation with these people, because what happened next was they said, "We will take you and your family and one piece of luggage," which we agreed to. And I have memories of traveling through France, of sleeping in a peasant's home. They had gotten out of their bed to give over to what was obviously wealthy refugees, and there were refugees all over France. And waking my parents up in the middle of the night saying, "What is that noise? What's that noise, Mom and Daddy?" Well, the noise were the rats that were running across the room. We went along the Pyrenees that separate France and Spain. And at one point, we were in a village that was separated by a river. And it were mountains on both sides. And my parents and the other couple were standing in front of a piece of wood, a piece of red wood. And they were discussing this. And I didn't understand what was going on, but I understood enough is that if you could get to the other side of the piece of red wood, you would be safe. If you would, on this side of the piece of red wood, you would not be safe. Because later on I realized that this was the border between France and Spain. Spain was neutral, although it was an ally of fascist Italy and Germany. But it was neutral. But you couldn't, because they would not admit refugees, and France wouldn't let you out. We finally, by car, arrived in Madrid the day after the British bombed them. And I can remember driving at night, looking out the window and seeing a house that had been destroyed by the bombing. And we stayed in a hotel where my father and this other man, whose name I don't know, that's why I assume it was some kind of financial arrangement just between them, because we never saw them later on. Anyway, they went and looked to try to find some way to get out of France, which was illegal. The borders were closed. They found a boat, and I remember getting on this, climbing up into this boat. It was very large, but there were very few people on it. And we went to North Africa. And it's funny what you remember as a child. I don't remember playing with Arab children in Casablanca and Oran and Tangier, all the cities where they moved, trying to find some way out of that part of Africa, because much of it was still controlled by the French government, now under the Vichy government, which was a pro-fascist government. But finally they found an airplane that would take them to Lisbon. Lisbon was neutral. So once we got onto that airplane and flew to Lisbon, we would be safe. And I remember the airplane going up and down, very beautiful green sea below us, because it hurt. At some point it dawned on me that this airplane goes up and down. It could just go down and it wouldn't go up again, and you'd be dead. But that didn't happen. We found ourselves in Lisbon, and ultimately ended up in Ellis Island, where, as Professor Goodman said, we caught the last boat out of Piraeus, the port of Athens. But we had no papers. And this was a time in America when spies were being caught on Long Island. You could go to Coney Island, in the right time you could watch a freighter being sunk by German U-boats out in plain sight of New York. So people were very suspicious. And we spent 3 months in Ellis Island. You were in there 24 hours a day. You were outside 1 hour a day. But they were nice as you could be given the situation in America. My father, as I said, had left some brothers here, and of course they had to check all of that out. Well, ultimately, we took a ferry at night in the twinkling lights of Manhattan. And, you know, I went on to go to school. But after the war, my father, who had never liked America, like many immigrants, went home. And what he found was a graveyard. The Dutch Jewish community was the largest by proportion before the war. About 2% of all Dutchmen were Jewish. And some 75 or 80% of them died in the war, including my grandmother, my cousin Gustav, who was worked to death in Mauthausen, and my aunt, who didn't get sent to the camp. But when the Germans had killed Gustav, they sent his mother a letter saying, "If you send us money, we will send you his ashes." Well, you know, she promptly had a stroke and died. But imagine, you know, you all have friends. Imagine most of them being dead. And now you come back to live in this place, and you remember, you go somewhere, you remember that this person lived over here. And, oh yes, we used to go and have coffee over there. All of this, you know, took a terrible toll on my family, and my father just had enough of it, and he died. So we did not directly end up in the camps, but the Holocaust has always sat in the back of our lives. My brothers spent a couple of years in England and finally went back after the war. Life took them back there and they settled there. But that's always kind of in the back of our minds, that this could happen in a place, you know, we used to think that Germany was a land of great culture, which it is. Great literature, great art, great poetry, certainly great music. And it turned into a country run by the most depraved criminals you could think of. So, anyway, I think I will call a halt.
We'll have lots of time for questions. Our next speaker is Lillian Matamore, and among other things, Lillian has joined the advisory board for the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust, and we are thrilled to have her as a member. And she's been coming to the lectures for a couple of years now, and she's grown to be a very familiar face to us. Lillian was born in Shanghai. It's a very intriguing story, and I will let her tell you how her parents got to Shanghai and her very interesting journey, finally, to this country. Lily, do you want to stand?
Okay. I was born in the what had been, up until the end of the war, the Japanese occupied Jewish ghetto of Shanghai, China. When I came to the United States and I was not yet 5 years old, people would ask me, "Where were you born?" And I would, looking like a normal American child, I would say, "China." And the question was always, "Oh, funny, you don't look Chinese, and were your parents missionaries?" So I will now answer those questions in great detail. My family was from Germany, had been in Germany for many, many years. My grandfather was a master tailor to the counts and barons of Europe. That is my mother's father. And my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, had divorced, which was very rare at the time, and my grandmother had moved to Berlin from Breslau, where my family was from, and so was no longer living with my grandfather and mother and my uncle when the Nazis came to power. My mother was 13 when the Nazis came to power, and so she grew up under the Nazi occupation. My grandfather always said, like so many Jews, in this land of Goethe and Schiller, the Nazis will never come to power. Hitler's a crackpot. He found out otherwise on Kristallnacht, when the synagogues and the businesses were destroyed, and he was taken to Buchenwald concentration camp, where he survived 6 weeks. At the time, the men were allowed to leave on the proviso that they take their families and immediately, within weeks, leave Germany. At this time, by this time, what had happened, I don't know if you know about the Evian conference, but President Roosevelt had convened a conference of many of the nations of the world to discuss what countries would be willing to enlarge their quota systems to receive people who were living under Nazi persecution. And it was decided at the conference that, I think I may have these numbers a little bit off, but it was only the Dominican Republic who was willing to take any additional Jews, and then only 5,000. And it was at this point that Hitler decided that he could, with impunity, rather than expel the Jews, eliminate them. This would be the answer to Germany's Jewish problem, because I believe it was, he said, look at how the world loves their Jews, seeing that no country would take them. So upon being released from Buchenwald, my grandfather came home knowing that the poets were not going to save him. And the only country to which they could escape at the time, and this was already 39, that did not require a visa was the open port of Shanghai. It was not a very welcoming place. There was incredible poverty, vice, corruption, disease. There was a rabbi in my family whose wife, when he was taken, had already bought tickets to Shanghai, and he refused to go. He ordered her to return the tickets. They later came to Shanghai via Siberia. My grandfather and mother sailed on the Conto Bianco Mano, an Italian liner, after traveling to the port of Genoa. They were allowed to spend whatever was necessary to book this passage, but were allowed to take out of the country only 10 German marks, and of course none of their valuables. So my grandfather took his sewing machine and very little else. They could only, on such short notice, book passage in first class. So they sailed for, I believe it was 4 weeks, in first class, being wined and dined, playing shuffleboard, relaxing on deck chairs on this ocean liner, and stopping at various ports along the way. So I have photographs of my grandfather and mother on the deck, playing shuffleboard, very well fed and tanned and looking quite healthy. When they disembarked in Shanghai, they disembarked into utter squalor. Their clothes were still the sort of thing that they would have worn in Germany, and were totally inappropriate. There fortunately had been in Shanghai a number of Sephardic Jews who had lived there for many, many years and had done very well financially, and it was due to the help of these Sephardic Jews that we survived. They organized housing, although it was very, very primitive, and fed us pretty much all through the war when it hit Shanghai. My father traveled with his mother. His father was no longer living at that time in Germany. He traveled with his mother on, I think it was a Kinu Maru, a Japanese liner, also to Shanghai. He had been a teacher in the English club in Germany, so he spoke English and was able to, in Shanghai, he was also quite tall. He was hired on by the International Shanghai Municipal Police Force, so he was able to work. My parents met again in Shanghai and married in 43. My mother's wedding dress a friend made from curtains, and they rode off from their wedding in a rickshaw. And that night, my father pawned his watch in order to pay for the hotel room. He was missing in the morning. My mother didn't know if she had lost her bridegroom because he had gone to pawn his watch. In 1943, I don't want to go too much into the Shanghai story. There's quite a bit more, but the Japanese, at the behest of the Germans, who still intended to do away with us, even though we were so far removed from Germany, the Japanese moved all of the Jews in Shanghai by proclamation into what would be called the Hankyu Ghetto, the area of Shanghai which had been bombed out in the 37 war. And when all of the Jews moved into Hankyu, where the Chinese were already living, we brought the population of Hankyu to double the density of Manhattan. So there was very little housing, and my father, being with the municipal police, received advance notice of this. My parents were going to move into the French concession, which was a very nice part of Shanghai, and my father could only tell my mother, guess what, we're not moving to the French concession, we're moving into Hankyu slum. And of course, she thought he'd lost his mind. But it was very, very fortunate because many of the Jews were unable to find housing pretty much of any kind there. There were families living in tiny rooms with only a curtain dividing two families. There were no toilets, there was no heat. There have been many memoirs written about Shanghai, and they're really quite interesting. We survived because the Japanese believed the German propaganda that we had this international power, and we had tons of influence in America with Roosevelt, and they felt we could be influential on their behalf if they did not destroy us. Also, they wanted manpower to settle Manchuria, which they had recently conquered, and the Jews would do quite well for that. None of that ever happened, but because of all of those political machinations and the help of the Sephardi Jews, we survived. Okay, I'm going to speed this up. When the war ended in 1945, and when the Allies bombed a radio station which the Japanese had put into the Hankyu Ghetto, my parents had worked with some friends of theirs to build a shelter. There wasn't time to make it to the shelter when the Allies bombed and killed a number of refugees, but when my parents came back to the shelter had collapsed. So, you know, again and again and again in our story, luck and the help of other people brought us through. At the end of the war, my parents thought they might stay in Shanghai. My father was now working for the American Post Exchange as a manager, so was my grandfather. But the communists were coming. And my parents knew, particularly my father, that you know, we had gotten out of Germany too late. We better not get out of Shanghai too late and be, stuck under communist rule. So my father, rather than wait for the International Refugee Organization to, and America who would not let us in, my father was under the Polish quota, which would have taken us 40 years to come to America. So they didn't want to wait. There was only one country still in the whole world where we could find refuge, and this is already after the war, and that was the newly formed state of Israel. Okay, this was now 1948. So we traveled with the International Refugee Organization, took us by ship, I was now 2 years old, to San Francisco. My grandfather had very wealthy relatives living in San Francisco since the early 1900s, didn't matter to the American government. My grandfather's relatives were allowed to visit the ship, we were not allowed off. From there, the government put us on sealed, guarded trains and shipped us across the American continent to Ellis Island. I remember my mother trading, I think it was Arizona, with Native Americans. I remember the beads and all the color. We were placed on Ellis Island. I don't remember how long we were there. Then we were taken again by the International Refugee Organization across we had already crossed the Pacific, now across the Atlantic Ocean to refugee camps in Italy, Bari, Italy. This is where I begin to have memories of standing in the lines for food, of the horrible smells of children vomiting, all this sort of thing. And my mother and I were in the women's camp. My grandfather and father were in the men's. From Trani, no, it wasn't Trani, it was Bari, we were taken on a leaky Turkish boat, fishing vessel, that was meant for like 30 people. And we were 300 refugees, kind of like the Exodus, only much smaller, to Haifa. We were supposed to be taken to Haifa, and I have vivid memories of being on board one evening. The ship, because it was overloaded, was starting to take on water, and my father and my grandfather, I remember, with all of the men running back and forth across the ship with buckets, bailing. My mother took me below deck, and the next morning we sailed into Haifa Harbor. So from there we were taken, at this time, thousands and thousands and thousands of refugees, do I continue? Were pouring into Israel. There were really no provisions for them. I mean, Israel had just fought a war with 5 Arab countries. So again, we were in refugee camps in Israel where there weren't enough medical supplies. My grandfather was I became very, very sick with dysentery, and they didn't think I was going to make it. My grandfather was able to sell a bolt of Chinese silk that he had brought from Shanghai to the camp officials to pay for the taxi to take me to relatives in a town called Kiryat Bialik. Anyway, we lived, to speed it up, we lived in Israel for 1.5 years. I grew up on the edge of the Mediterranean, running the beaches. We sailed, eventually we got one of our relatives to sponsor us to come to America. We sailed back across the Atlantic. I traveled by train again across the continent back to first Los Angeles and then to San Francisco, and grew up in San Francisco in a community pretty much of German and Austrian survivors of Shanghai. So that's my story.
Thank you. Thank you, Lillian. If anybody wants to know about crossing back and forth across, I took the train across the United States this summer, and I can't imagine that it was much fun when you did it. Our last speaker is Vera Korkus. Vera was born in Vienna and has, in her experience, the sad experience of having been in a death camp. We are most honored to have her here today. It is very difficult to find survivors who count that as part of their experience, because increasingly the people who tell us about their Holocaust experiences were children. Yeah. But Vera was older, and she's going to speak to us now.
Oh, thank you. I want to start out with saying that.
Closer.
Oh, okay. At any time, if you have a question, please ask it in between. It'll make it much better for both of us, because you will get the answers of what you're interested in, and I won't go on what may not be of interest to you. In any event, as Professor Goodman said, I was born in Vienna in 1928. We can figure that out pretty quickly. And incidentally, anybody curious, I had surgery on my shoulder a couple of weeks ago, so it's nothing very serious. In 1938, when I was 10 years old, the Germans invaded Austria, and schools were no longer permitted for Jewish children.
Excuse me, Vera?
Yep.
They're having a bit of trouble hearing you, so you need to bring the microphone perhaps a little closer.
Okay.
Is it on?
Well, I didn't want to blast.
Is it
them
on?
because
Is it
that's-
turned on?
Can you hear me?
Blast away, Vera.
Blast away.
So, to from then on,
You
still not close enough.
You're going to have to put it right to your
Oh
mouth.
dear.
I'll stand here if you want me to. No, keep it right
No,
there.
I can hold it there, but I don't want to make it too loud.
No, it's fine. You're not too loud.
Okay. There was one incident, I must say. I had a crush on a teacher at that time. I was in 4th grade in elementary school, and we were no longer allowed, as I said, to go to school. And one day I ran into her in the street, and she stopped me. And she said to me, they can take everything away from you, but what you have in your head, nobody can take away. And I must say, to this day, I remember this, and it is something that's helped me throughout all the years of the war, because it strengthened my will that I have something that nobody can take. Well, anyway, in '42, we were picked up to be sent to Theresienstadt. I have a sister and I had a brother. My sister went underground. She was 17 and refused to go. My brother had been in a concentration camp earlier on and was also released in 1939 with a proviso that he would have to leave the country within 2 weeks. And he went with a group of young people supposedly to go to Israel. The Germans stopped them in Yugoslavia, and he, being young and 18 years old and adventurous, escaped and made his way through Albania to Italy, where he disappeared, and we have never heard from him again. The assumption was that he had joined the guerrillas in Italy, according to the Red Cross. My parents and we were shipped off to Theresienstadt, and my father died there within 3 months. My mother and I were there until 43, and in October 43, they started evacuating train loads of us to ship to Auschwitz. We went on the train. I have no idea how long it took. It took several days. And when we arrived there, they made us line up, and the very famous, or infamous, I should say, line, they were standing there, and dividing us. One went left and the other one went right, and my mother went to the right and I went to the left, and I had no idea what was happening at that time. Of course, we went to a bathhouse, so-called, and they shaved our heads, and my name was called out, and I stepped forward. And the woman said to me, "Come with me." And when I went to the back with her, there was my sister. She had been, somebody had snitched on her in Vienna, and she was arrested and sent to Auschwitz. And she said, "Where's our mother?" I said, "I don't know. She was with me a half hour ago." And she ran off, and she was working there to sort the clothing of the people who had arrived and everything else. And she told me afterwards, she went and she had a knife and she was going to kill the guy who had separated us, and the other girls kept her from doing that. She came back and she gave me a kerchief, 5 cigarettes, and she said to me, "Don't smoke those. Use those to buy yourself some privileges." And then there was the last I saw of her at that time. We were divided into barracks and stayed there for a month, I think, 3 weeks or a month. And then we were shipped off to various camps. They divided 1,000 women, and we were sent to Silesia to dig ditches as tank traps, because the Russians were coming through Poland into Silesia, into Germany. The one thing that was very vivid for me is that while we were waiting to be put on the train, it was several days and nights that we had to stay outside, and we were staying in front of the crematorium where the flames were coming out of the chimneys. And of course I knew my mother had gone through that too, and I lost my hearing at that time. I saw people move their mouths and I just couldn't hear anything. Well, my hearing came back anyway. So we went to that camp where we were digging the ditches, and we stayed there for about till January of '44, when the Russians were coming closer, and they evacuated us, and we went on those very famous death march to, supposedly, what the guard said, to Gross Rosen. And on the way, we had rest periods because they also had to rest. We were marching, so they were getting tired just as well as we did. So we stopped off in a courtyard of a former reformatory, and that entire town had been evacuated. There wasn't a German soul to be seen or heard. And while we were sitting there, I had made friends with 2 Czech girls, and I looked at them and I said, "I'm going to take off." And they said, "We were just talking about it too." So there was on the side of the courtyard, which was very extensive, a barn. So we kind of sneaked through the people and we made our way there, and we climbed up the ladder and we dug ourselves into the straw. And pretty soon, of course, when they started counting people, they knew that not only we were missing, but we didn't know there were a bunch of women already in the straw there. So there was one SS man came up and he started screaming and yelling, "Get out of there and go back." And while he turned our back to us, we scrambled down the ladder and ran through a field to another barn. And in that barn, the straw was piled very high, and we dug ourselves in as deep as we could. They came looking for us, but they didn't have time anymore. They kind of stabbed around with their bayonets in the thing, but they never got to us. So they took off, and we were left behind. We did find some women in that they had also left, but they were so sick that they just couldn't walk, or they couldn't make it. And funnily enough, they didn't do anything to them, they just left them. We stayed there for a day and a night, and when it got dark, we thought we were going to walk towards the Russian during the night while it was dark. And both my friends had a pretty heavy accent when they spoke German. So we walked through the night, and suddenly, out of the bushes, some German soldiers yelled, "Halt," and we stopped, and I said, "Better let me talk." And they said, "What are you doing here, and where are you coming from?" So I said, "We belong to the German youth group who are doing agricultural work." I don't know where I got this from. And they said, "No, you can't go through here. This is the front already, and you have to turn back." So we did. What they didn't see, of course, that none of us had a stitch of hair. We were all bald because it was dark. Our clothing was shreds. It was totally rags. And in a few days, then the Russians came. And we stayed there with the Russians until the end of the war. At the end of the war, I went to Czechoslovakia because I figured my sister is dead, everybody's dead, why should I go back to Vienna? I didn't have much peace. I did go to Vienna in the end and did find my sister. Through the people where she had been hiding before somebody gave her away. So now if you have any questions, please.
We're going to open up to questions for everybody. Thank you, Dave. Okay.
The husband, in fact, had been a communist, which of course was very dangerous.
Thank you.
Oh, here.
Would you?
I'll hold.
Would you also have the students talk into the
I
microphone?
will. I'll do
can't
that.
get them.
I'll hold.
they'll keep
I'll
it
hold.
busy.
I'll be busy. Yeah.
My sister was, when she stayed with these very nice people, what she did, she did black marketing. She went to the country and she got things from the peasants and she brought them, I don't know, shirts or whatever she could get a hold of. And she was dealing and trading. And we did the same thing, by the way, when I was back in Vienna because times were terrible. We did just black marketing. And so she survived until, of course. The funny thing is that all three of us, I was the youngest, my sister was middle, my brother was the oldest, that all three of us tried to escape and make our way away from it. And I can only ascribe this to our parents who brought us up very independently.
Speak up, please.
Hold on.
My question is, when you finally ended up in Italy for the refugee camp, did you face anti-Semitism in Italy since they were once inhabited or allies with the Germans?
Now,
I can't run.
now we actually never, I remember a day trip out of Bari to Trani, but other than that, we had no contact with the populace in Italy. We were refugees in the camps living with thousands of other refugees, so we had no opportunity to experience anti-Semitism there.
Okay, next.
I can speak louder.
You
Oh,
can
great.
speak.
Mary, you mentioned that your teacher, when you were young, told you some words of wisdom right before everything, got crazy, and that helped you get through it. I was just wondering if either Maurice or Lillian had other people who were inspirations to them, perhaps your family or a particular family member that may have said something or done something that was motivational and inspirational for you to get through it.
Well, the only one I can think of was the only member of my family actually to survive, and that was a second cousin twice removed. He was a communist, so he had a price on his head, and he went underground and worked with the underground, and I met him after the war in his new life, which was very different than before the war. And he was an inspiration, partly because he had done things that were like out of a movie. I mean, he spent the war years dressed in a German Army Engineering Corps uniform, laying a cable between Amsterdam and Brussels for the use of the underground. When his parents were told to report to a transportation center called the Judenrat, he went dressed again in disguise as a German soldier. They were going to go to some place in Poland, Auschwitz, and he said, "I will get you out of here. You just turn around, you leave everything, you follow me." And they said, no, we'll be okay, we'll work hard and so forth. Well, of course, that was Auschwitz, and that was the end of them. At the end of the war, he was penniless, but he was carving little dolls and putting them out on the street for people to buy. And the man came through and looked at him and said, you make these? He said, yes. And that man sponsored him to art school, and he became an artist after the war, a sculptor. And his determination, and when I saw him after the war, he'd stopped being a communist. Reality had struck about what that entailed, really. But that would be personal.
I think the person I would have to say that inspired me was my grandfather. I grew up with him, and by example, well, he always used to say, "You got to take the people the way they are, not the way they're supposed to be," and he lived that. And when he opened a tailor shop, the only place that he could, which is in the Tenderloin in San Francisco, I would watch him sing opera. He was an opera singer. He would sing opera arias at the sewing machine, and people would come in off the street to listen. And when, no matter who it was, the prostitutes in that neighborhood or the alcoholics, whoever came in, he would clasp a silver dollar in their palm and say, "Save it, don't spend it." And he knew very well where that was going. That kind of compassion of the open hand has always inspired me.
Yes?
This is for all three of you. Our teacher, our professor has been having us read this really amazing book, War and Genocide, and I've been really, struggling to read it. It's giving me tension headaches, and it's just really intense, And sorry, I'm totally okay. So I was wondering, there was a lecture last week about, he said that over 50,000 people were directly responsible for what happened to you guys. And then I was Googling the number of trials, and it seems like not that many people were prosecuted. And I was just wondering, how do you, not my generation in Germany, but how do you even, go to Germany and deal with anybody in your generation? Because it's just crazy to me, It seems like, in this book there's just event after event of people just, laughing or just, doing nothing, and how do you deal with humanity after that,
Vera, would you like to start? Hold it close.
I remember.
Closer.
Getting warmer.
Getting warmer.
She's got my number. I usually speak very low. It's quite true. The thing is, hate consumes you more than it does any good. Let me tell you a story which I wasn't able to tell for about 15 years. It's a little gruesome, but when we were on the front, the war wasn't over yet, and we were fairly brutalized. And there were some chickens and ducks and geese running around. And I forgot to say that we were with that group of women that had been left behind who were sick. They recovered, more or less. So we had the brilliant idea to take those chickens and geese and ducks and chop off their heads and give them names. Each one we chopped the head off had the name of one of the SS that was watching us. It took me a long, long time to be able to speak about it. And I was ashamed of that for so long. And although I lost 15 relatives in the war, I never, after this incident with those poor things, hated anybody. Really hated. I can say I disliked them. I'm suspicious of them, but I didn't hate them. And because I came to the conclusion what we had done at that time had done us more harm while we were alive, of course, than they could have done. Going back to the woman who said they can take it away from you, I don't know whether this is a satisfactory answer for you or not. But we have prejudice, and hate is doing us more harm. It is dragging us down. Rather than elevating us to humanity.
Thank you. Lillian?
I've spent probably the last 15 or more years researching because I wanted some answers to my life. How did this all happen? How could it have all come to be? And am still reading. I guess the shift in me has come very slowly. I acknowledge your facts. The Nuremberg trials did not nearly convict all of the people involved, and many of the people involved were pardoned for lots of reasons I won't go into. But my conclusions of late, my sense, in response to your question about hate, it's all a lot more complicated than I had imagined. And there are really so many parties complicit in what happened that I believe that there is not, in my heart, I believe that we are all complicit in so many things that are happening today in ways that we don't realize. And the people of Europe were complicit, but then so were the people in the governments who did not allow us to be rescued. I guess the conclusion that I've come to now in my life is that every single thing that we do, every word that we utter has impact. And we most of the time won't know what that impact is, what the ramifications will be, what the circumstances of someone's life are that will be changed because of our actions. And it's made me think very carefully about a lot of things that I'm doing and the way I'm living my life. That's all I can say.
One of the things that I've noticed for me is a difference between the younger generation of Germans and those people who are now, well, you know, they're almost gone, and we're almost all gone. But the ones in the, particularly in the 80s, who, you know, as terrible as the Germans were, they suffered at the end of the war. I mean, if you read about the terror bombings that happened, and they were terror bombings. There was no strategic reason for doing, what the British and we Americans did. Those people that survived all that, and the next generation of Germans, I found very, very different than the ones that perpetrated all of that. But I think every country in Western Europe had people who aided and abetted the Germans, who fought with them side by side in Russia, died with them in the name of a fascist future. They were Dutch, they were Belgian, they were French. So lots of people. But as far as Germany is concerned, I think it's a completely different country than it was in the 1920s and 30s.
I think I mentioned in section, Russian-occupied Germany was not a very nice place. 12 million Russians died at the hands of the Germans, and they were very, very vengeful. And some of the ugliest things that I've read about that era have to do with the behavior of Russian soldiers in Berlin and other areas.
Yeah.
Yes.
Have you guys revisited or thought of revisiting places that you had been in the past? I know it's like some of you travel a lot, but like important
The
places.
question is whether our panelists have revisited the places that they were or born or experienced various
No,
things.
I got the question. I have not been back to any of the camps. I know a number of people who have taken their husbands who were American and didn't know, or their children. No, I have not. I have been to Europe several times, and 3 years ago I went to Vienna, and I hadn't been there since '49, since I came to the States, and it was a foreign country to me. I mean, I remembered the streets and all of that, but it meant absolutely nothing to me. I was totally emotionless towards it, except being in another city.
I happened to be in Italy in the 80s and accidentally boarded the wrong train, which was a third-class train, and all of these things went through my head about, oh my God, they're going to ask for my papers, and they're going to haul me off the train. But it was purely fiction, but it was really interesting to me how strong those feelings were. They were very, very real. I've been back to Israel, but would like to go to China, but I'm very allergic to cigarette smoke, so that's not going to happen.
Yeah, I've been back to Holland several times, and the last trip was in 2007. I was amazed because I finally understood what the Dutch went through in World War II when they stripped the country of every piece of wood you could burn. Because in 1944, in the winter hunger, people starved to death in Holland. They took everything, including in the Jewish ghetto in Amsterdam, they took all the window frames and all the door frames and all the doors out. All they left were the bricks. And when I asked a friend of mine, and he said, why is that? And he explained that to me. And now it's a completely different country. But what I really want to tell you is if you go to New York, go to Ellis Island. They have turned Ellis Island into a wonderful museum of emigration. They also have a website. If any of your ancestors came to America before 1925, you can find their names. They digitized a lot of them and they ran out of money. and you can also find the boat that they sailed on, which is kind of neat. But it isn't the same place that I was. They've changed it since I was there, but the main outlines are still there. And brought back a bunch of pleasant memories. They were nice, but it's a great place to visit, either online or definitely in person.
Can you speak loudly?
I have a question kind of building off what was said earlier. I'm just wondering if, and it's an open question for all three of you, if any of you have since that time, met any or had any conversations directly with any people that were a part of the Nazi Party or part even of the Japanese occupational force?
Perpetrators?
Had any-
Whether they've met any perpetrators?
Well, I've met a German victim. He lives here in Sonoma County, and his parents died in an air raid shelter. One of the nice things that happens when the bombs fall close by is that, I guess, the blast pressure wave, goes into the air raid shelter, and they were all. I don't know why he wasn't killed, but he survived, and he came to the land of the people that killed him. His family. He's the only person directly involved that I've ever met.
He was young.
Huh?
He was young too.
Yeah, and he was young. Yeah, he was young. Yeah.
No, I haven't directly had contact with any perpetrators.
Neither have I. The only thing that comes to mind, I had a friend, they lived in the same apartment house that we lived, and she was 3 months older than I, so she was closer to me than my sister. We were just inseparable. Her father had been what was then called, when the Germans came, an illegal Nazi, which was illegal before March 1938. And when that happened, she met me in the stairwell one day, and tears running down her face, and she said to me, "I am forbidden to speak to you." Well, I also cried. We were 10 years old at that time, and we had been so close. After the war, I did find them. They still lived in the same place. And she and I got together a few times, but our lives had been so different that there was just no common ground any longer. So after a few months, it just fell apart, it just died down. And of course, I didn't want to see her parents. And that's about all. Otherwise, I didn't.
Question? Yes.
After all you've been through, this is for all three of you, has it affected your views towards your faith, like your Jewish faith? For example, when my grandmother came through Ellis Island to New York, and she, after what she went through, she became closer to the synagogue. What has your views, if you were too young to really, have your views towards your faith, and you know what you know, or has it affected how close you are to a synagogue, or just your Jewish faith in general?
Could you hear in the back? Okay.
Yeah, I guess so. It killed my faith.
I probably have a very strong Jewish identity, but
Yes.
I'm not religious. I'm not a believer. I don't really resonate with religion.
Before I say anything about my own belief, I would like to say that I am for people who are religious. I think it is a very good thing, because they have something to hold on to, something to bring them through difficulties. Their faith is very helpful. As far as I'm concerned, when my mother went into the gas chamber, I thought, this God is malevolent, and I stopped believing in God. I am considering myself a humanist, for all it's worth.
You know, there was a thing on television, which I think may actually have been based on real events, in which inmates of one of the concentration camps put God on trial for breaking a contract with us. And
Yes, it's a play.
I can't remember who wrote the play. Anyway, it's an interesting idea, and I've heard, and I don't know if it's a myth that this actually happened, at which they found God guilty of doing that, and then because it was on the eve of Friday night, at the end of that, a rabbi who was there said, "And now let us pray."
Yes?
This question is for Vera. How would you describe meeting with your sister again after?
The questioner would like to know
Yes.
how to describe how the circumstances around, I think you want to know how she felt, right?
Yeah.
Meeting her sister again.
Well, I had gone to the people who had been hiding her, and when they saw me, they said, "Oh my God, your sister thought you were dead." But my sister at that time was in the hospital. She had a very severe infection in her knee. And so the transportation at that time in 45 didn't work, so I walked to the hospital there, and I walked into the room, and she nearly fell out of bed. Well, she had thought I was dead, I thought she was dead, so we were both very happy, and I was ecstatic, in fact, because to find her was so totally unexpected that it's undescribable.
Yes?
I have a question for Vera, maybe Maurice, I'm not sure, maybe all three of you. Were any of the Nazis, did any of them treat you any better than the others? Because I can imagine prior to the Holocaust, the Germans and the Jews had some sort of relationship. Were any of them less brutal than others, maybe?
Any evidence of Nazis who behaved, shall we say, in a good way?
Yeah.
That's also an oxymoron, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, there was a small incident. Yes, you know, you're grateful for small mercies. My mother had in Theresienstadt, when it was my birthday, traded somebody with her ration of bread for a watch for me. I had never had a watch. And in Auschwitz, when they stripped us of everything, I tore the band, the wristband off the watch, and I stuck it under my tongue. And they said, "Stick out your tongue," and they were examining us where one shouldn't, really, just to find whether anything was hidden. Anyway, I got away with it. When I was in the last camp, two things happened. First, they marched us through that village every morning to go and dig the ditches and carry tree trunks to strengthen the walls of the ditches. And we walked by one house, and the people were obviously had to pull their blinds down and were not allowed to come out in the street. And as I walked by a door, a small crack opened, and somebody threw out a knitted tube. You know, like girls used to wear here on the beach then, they were just tubes of something. Well, I snatched it up very quickly. That was a very kind thing to do. And the other thing was that one of the men who were watching us, I don't know how he found out that I had that watch, which wasn't working anyway. And he said to me, I should give him the watch, and I said no. And he didn't do anything to me, he left me alone. So that was another kindness.
After the war, 46, 47, my father had died. My mother took me to Scheveningen, which is an oceanside resort, and we were sitting in the dining room, big room, lots of people in there, everybody's talking, eating. The door opens up. A man and a woman come through, and the entire dining room becomes silent. People sit down, and slowly people begin to go back to what they were doing. I asked my mother, who is this? Why, what is this fuss? This was a man called Assa, and his family comes from a diamond cutting industry. It's an old industry in Holland, and it goes back a long way. And the house of Assa were famous diamond cutters. They go back, a couple hundred years. Well, he got himself, he was very wealthy, and he found friends among the Germans because they made him an honorary Aryan, for which he paid. And of course, he survived the war as alive. What his life was like, I don't know. But if you had enough money, you could be treated differently.
Kind of.
Kind of.
Don't put this under your tongue.
Oh, yes.
We have a question back there.
This question is for Kara. I wanted to know what you traded your 5 cigarettes for.
What did you trade your
Good question.
What did you trade what?
What did you trade your 5 cigarettes for?
Oh, yeah.
When we were in the barracks, you must have heard or so, there were capos,
Yeah.
and there were 3 girls who had the say of what we could do and what we couldn't do. The bunks were constructed in 3 layers, and on each layer were 12 people, and the way we were laying there was like sardines, head to toe, head to toe. That's how we fitted in. You were not allowed to get off, except in the morning and at night when we had to go outside. We were allowed to go to the latrine and were counted. I traded my cigarettes for being able to get off that bunk and walk up and down in the barracks, because that was the only way that I could, having had the shock of my mother having been killed, that was my only outlet to walk up and down and get rid of some of this. I can't even call it anxiety. I don't know what the shock is really the best way. They didn't last very long, but anyway, I got that privilege.
Ready for one last burning question? Yes.
Again, another question for all 3 of you. After all of your different levels of upheaval and emotional and physical, all of the traveling and your escape, Lillian, all of your time in the refugee camps, once everything started to settle down, what did you initially do to try to rebuild yourselves, or what did your families do? And did you face any individual obstacles, like maybe something severe, even like an emotional or existential crisis, or did you use what happened as like a platform to rebuild?
Excuse me for 1 second. Before we finish, I would like to say something to the class too.
Sure.
Okay, is that all right? Should I do it
Finish
now?
this question,
Yeah.
and then you can do it.
Okay. Asking for privileges again.
Where are the cigarettes?
That's right.
No
where's the
smoking on
cigarette?
campus.
my reaction, I must say, my sister and she had been together in camp. She had found a classmate. We, all three of us, lived in an apartment which had been a Nazi apartment. We got. And what we did, in fact, I was at that time just 16 going on 17, my sister was 21, and so was the other girl. We were so hungry for entertainment and for life and for anything, so since we were dealing on the black market, what we did is buy materials and have clothes made. And we went dancing to what they call it 5 o'clock tea almost every single day. But it came a point where I had enough, and I started reading books, and I hardly understood any of it. But I read whatever I could get my hands on, and became a little reclusive at that time, because I wanted to learn. I thought there is nobody to tell me what is right and what is wrong, and to guide me, and I better pick it up by myself. And I went from there. I would like to say something before.
Well, why don't we let Lillian and Maurice finish, and then you
okay.
can have the floor.
Well, I was not yet 5 years old when we came to this country, but I was an only child. I didn't speak English when we came here. German is my mother tongue. So it was always a matter of being a whole lot different. And as I said, being born in China there were a number of times where in school we would be saying the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag and talking about citizenship, and I wasn't a citizen, and I knew from all of the adult conversation in my family that America was the reason that we had gone here and gone there, and so there was a sense of the story being a little different, and I think I've always been a little bit skeptical about most everything.
Yeah. My father, who was at that point in his late 50s, I think tried to put his life back together again as though it hadn't happened. Which I can understand. It didn't work, and he died. I think for me, a long time, I felt, because I had, we'd been to America, and I went back to home, went to high school, came back to America. So I felt neither American nor European. And that took a long time for me to really realize that, yes, I am an American.
Okay.
Oh, yes,
Would you pass
sorry.
that to
Yes,
me?
sure.
Yes. I would like to say something that does and does not concern us. I know that many of the people that are sitting here today have problems, as we all have. And the one thing that I did learn is not to have self-pity. I think if you have a problem, don't lock it up. Don't feel sorry for yourself. Speak to somebody. I don't care who it is, a relative, a teacher, a friend's mother, anybody. Speak to them, because if you do not, and you just live with your self-pity, you will paralyze yourself. You will be incapable of leading your life. That was the lesson that I, in fact, learned or taught myself, and it has come in good stead. And I thank you for listening.